Due to the length of this particular gospel reading, you may remain seated as we hear the Holy Gospel according to John. Glory to you, O Lord. As Jesus was going along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. "Teacher," his disciples asked him, "whose sin was it that caused this man to be born blind? Did he sin or did his parents?" "He didn't sin," replied Jesus, "nor did his parents. It happened so that God's works could be seen in him. We must work the works of the one who sent me as long as it's still daytime. The night is coming, and nobody can work then. As long as I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world." With these words, he spat on the ground and made some mud out of his spittle. He spread the mud on the man's eyes. "Off you go," he said to him, "and wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went off and washed. When he came back, he could see. His neighbors and the people who used to see him begging remarked on this. "Isn't this the man," they said, "who used to sit here and beg?" "Yes, it's him," said some of them. "No, it isn't," said some others. "It's somebody like him." But the man himself spoke. "Yes, it's me," he said. "Well, then," they said to him, "how did your eyes get opened?" "It was the man called Jesus," he replied. "He made some mud, then he spread it on my eyes and told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I could see." "Where is he?" they asked. "I don't know," he replied. They took the man who had been blind and brought him to the Pharisees. The day Jesus had made the mud and opened his eyes was a Sabbath. So the Pharisees began to ask him again how he had come to see. "He put some mud on my eyes," he said, "and I washed, and now I can see." "This man can't be from God," some of the Pharisees began to say. "He doesn't keep the Sabbath." But, replied some of the others, "how can a man who is a sinner do signs like these?" And they were divided. So they spoke to the blind man again. "What have you got to say about him?" they asked. "He opened your eyes after all." "He's a prophet," he replied. The Judeans didn't believe that he had really been blind and now could see. So they called the parents of the newly sighted man and put the question to them. "Is this man really your son?" they asked, "the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can now see?" "Well," replied his parents, "we know that he is indeed our son and that he was born blind, but we don't know how it is that he can now see, and we don't know who it is that opened his eyes. Ask him. He's grown up. He can speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Judeans. The Judeans, you see, had already decided that if anyone declared that Jesus was the Messiah, they should be put out of the synagogue. That's why his parents said, "He's grown up, so you should ask him." So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind. "Give God the glory," they said. "We know that this man is a sinner." "I don't know whether he's a sinner or not," replied the man. "All I know is this. I used to be blind, and now I can see." "What did he do to you?" they asked. "How did he open your eyes?" "I told you already," replied the man, "and you didn't listen. Why, do you want to hear it again? You don't want to become his disciples too, do you?" "You're his disciple," they scoffed, "but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses, but we don't know where this man comes from." "Well, here's a fine thing," replied the man. "You don't know where he's from, and he opened my eyes. We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but if anyone is devout and does his will, he listens to them. It's never ever been heard of before that someone should open the eyes of a person born blind. If this man wasn't from God, he couldn't do anything." "You were born in sin from top to toe," they replied, "and are you going to start teaching us?" and they threw him out. Jesus heard that they had thrown the man out. He found him and spoke to him. "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" he asked. "Who is he, sir?" asked the man, "so that I can believe in him." "You have seen him," replied Jesus. "In fact, it's the person who's talking to you." "Yes, sir," said the man, "I do believe." And he worshiped him. "I came into the world for judgment," said Jesus, "so that those who can't see would see, and so that those who can see would become blind." Some of the Pharisees were nearby, and they heard this. "So," they said, "we're blind too, are we?" "If you were blind," replied Jesus, "you would not be guilty of sin. But now, because you say we can see, your sin remains." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
There's a lot of layers to this story in John's Gospel, but it starts with a man who is blind from birth. And this is an important detail, not just for the story, but also for us. Because while being born blind is a rare disability, the fact is that all of us have some kind of limitation that we've either been born with or that we develop later in life. Well, eye problems are fairly common. Look at how many of us wear glasses or contact lenses, not to mention those who've had cataract surgery or other kinds of eye surgery. But there are all kinds of limitations that we have no choice but to learn how to live with. My son Liam, for example, was born with a hearing loss, and he's worn hearing aids since he was 2 years old. The ironic thing is, even when he didn't wear his hearing aids and didn't catch everything you might say, he still loved to talk. He didn't let not hearing everything hold him back from that. An even more common limitation, especially as springtime approaches, is seasonal allergies. Is there anyone else out there besides me who dreads the inevitable allergic reactions to all the beautiful blossoms and buds that will be coming? Whatever condition you might have to deal with, it's only natural to ask why, or why me? Back in Jesus' day, the common assumption was that a serious disability, such as blindness, was God's punishment for sin. That's why the disciples asked Jesus, whose sin caused this man to be born blind? Did he sin, or did his parents sin? They're searching for answers to the difficult realities that people live with. And Jesus puts a stop to it right away. He did not sin, and neither did his parents. No one is at fault for the man's blindness. Even though it's not fair that he should be blind, these things happen. And in fact, they happen to every one of us to one degree or another. Yet, when you accept and maybe even embrace the limitations that God has given you, it becomes easier to have your heart and mind opened to the ways that God is working in your life and in the world. This is what happens for the man in today's gospel, the man born blind. Because he is so well aware of his limitations, in this case blindness, he is open to the way Jesus wants to work within him. Jesus makes some mud out of spit and dirt. And this harkens back to the story of Adam and Eve, when God fashions man out of the dust of the earth. And Jesus rubs the dirt in the man's eyes and tells him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. And he goes and washes, and his eyes are opened. He can see he's been healed. Maybe you hear a story like this, and reflecting on your own limitations, you might think, okay, Jesus, that's great, but why not me? The kind of healing we might experience is usually not so dramatic. It might be, but usually it's more subtle, more gradual. Very often, the healing we receive through Christ is not a cure for our disabilities or ailments, but it is a new awareness of the gifts that God leaves behind within the limitation. Here's a small thing as an example. And I know this might sound like sacrilege to some, but I actually prefer winter to spring. Anybody else out there with me? Yeah, all right, there's one. You were in Montana where it's really winter, yeah. You do too? No. Peyton, did you raise your hand? Yeah. In the winter, I don't have allergies making me miserable. In the spring, I am frequently miserable whenever I go outside, and all of those beautiful things are budding and flowering. So this has taught me to appreciate being outdoors in the winter months. It's led me to embrace activities such as cross-country skiing and snowshoeing. And doing those things has opened my eyes to the beauty of the bare tree branches and the snow-covered forests. I've gained an appreciation of the blessings God leaves for us in the coldest months of the year, which perhaps I would not have gained if not for the limitations that God has given me to live with. Now, would I rather not have to deal with allergies? Of course. But since I do have to deal with them, I can allow my limitations to point me towards God's glory revealed in the world. I can rely on God to lead me into new ways of being in the world that integrate my own experiences of limitation. And therefore, even though I have not been cured, I have been healed. Healing, restoration, renewal. This is the purpose of the Sabbath. It's also why Jesus came into the world, so that he could help us and walk with us through faith until we get to that point where we're able to join the man born blind in confessing, I used to be blind, and now I can see. On the other hand, we can also choose to walk in the way of the Pharisees in this story. They can see, and yet they become blind. Why? Because they see everything with a rigid certitude. They think they have the answer to everything, even when they don't have the answer. And they close themselves off to the possibility of seeing things from different perspectives. And here, right in front of their eyes, they're witnessing Jesus acting to fulfill the purpose of the Sabbath. And yet all they can do is criticize him for working on the day of rest, when the whole purpose of the Sabbath, not to mention the purpose of Christ's resurrection, is to bring healing, restoration, and renewal to the whole creation. And this is what Jesus has done for the man born blind. Even though it's right in front of their eyes, they won't open their hearts and minds to see it, and therefore they have become blind. But before we come down too hard on them, we should take a moment to just acknowledge how easy it is for any one of us to fall into that same mindset as this group of Pharisees. It's a mindset that is born of our desire to be in control, even in control of things we have no control over. It's kind of like what Mark Twain once said, one of my favorite quotes. It's not the things you don't know that get you into trouble. It's the things you know for certain that just ain't so. Christian faith offers a threefold pathway that we can follow to be healed of this mindset. That threefold pathway is humility, surrender, and love. Humility means acknowledging your limitations and acknowledging your need for God so that God's power can be at work within your weakness. Growing in humility then allows you to surrender to Christ, which means giving up your illusions of control and opening yourself to experiencing God's grace and mercy. Humility and surrender in turn allow you to learn how to truly love others in the way of Christ, with the kind of love that Christ already has for us. And this kind of love, agape love as it's called, means to selflessly seek the well-being of others and to accept them for who God made them to be. Very often, it takes going through a time of suffering that pushes us to find this pathway. And when you do find that pathway, Christ is already there to meet you. And it's not that you want to suffer. It's not that God wants you to suffer. But suffering does have a unique capacity to bring us closer to God. As long as we allow ourselves to acknowledge the suffering and to grieve the losses and limitations that the suffering has imposed, and to trust God to help us through it. That's when you just might be surprised. Like the man born blind was surprised when blindness became his pathway to sight. That even in our darkest days and in our most difficult life experiences, the crucified Christ is present with you, working in you with his grace to eventually raise you up again to be with him, restored, renewed, and healed.